I had a lot of fun making the Confessions of a Cuomosexual video, and I come across these interesting Twitter threads from time to time. So I thought I'd make a series out of it, where I just go through some of them with you. So with that said, let's get into it, and you can let me know if you would like to see more of the Twitter videos in the future on this channel, or if I should just stick to the commentaries. Okay, so this week's Twitter thread is from Sean P. McCarthy, and I really don't know who this guy is, except that he popped up on my Twitter feed because Sam Harris liked a tweet of his. It was actually this whole thread. So I went through, and it just blew my mind. So this first one, he's going to list some of the suspicious deaths in the JFK assassination, starting with the most obvious one, which I guess would be the Lee Harvey Oswald assassination by Jack Ruby. Okay, in this next one he says, Bill Hunter was a reporter for the Long Beach Independent Press Telegram. With permission from Jack Ruby's lawyer, he searched Ruby's apartment. In 1964, he was shot dead by a policeman in the press room of a Long Beach police station who claimed his gun misfired. Jim Koth was a reporter for the Dallas Times-Herald who searched Ruby's apartment along with Hunter. He decided to write a book about the JFK assassination. In September 1964, a man broke into his apartment and killed him. Dorothy Killigan was one of the most famous female investigative journalists in the country. She began writing a book about the JFK assassination, telling a friend she's going to bust this case wide open. November 1965, she dies of an overdose. All of her notes for the book disappear. David Ferrie was a pilot who worked with FBI agent Guy Bannister to arm anti-Castro exiles. He was in contact with Oswald in New Orleans, yet denied having ever met him. 1967, it is reported that DA Jim Garrison is investigating JFK and Ferrie is a suspect. 5 days later, Ferrie is dead. Mary Pinchot Meyer was the ex-wife of CIA agent Cord Meyer and JFK's lover. CIA agent Jim Angleton recorded their tryst and then broke into her home and stole her diary after her death. October 1964, she is shot dead execution style while jogging in Washington, D.C. The case is unsolved. Jack Ruby himself dies in 1967, having already been sentenced to death. He begged the Warren Commission to bring him to Washington to testify as he was afraid to say what he knew while in Texas. They refused. CIA Doc Jolly West visited him in prison before he had a mental breakdown. By the way, there's literally no mention of Jolly West in Jack Ruby's Wikipedia. It seems notable to me that Ruby was visited in prison by a CIA doctor who performed LSD experiments for MK Ultra. After examining Ruby, he announces to the press that Ruby is psychotic. Gary Underhill was a CIA informant and military correspondent for Life magazine. Within 24 hours of the assassination, he told a friend, Oswald is a patsy. They set him up. He alleged a connection with plots against Castro and feared for his life. Dead of a gunshot wound, May 1964. Winston M. Scott was CIA station chief for Mexico City, 1956 to 1969. When Lee Harvey Oswald visited the Cuban and Soviet embassies in 1963, Scott was adamant that the CIA photographed him entering and leaving and that Oswald was recorded on a wiretap. The CIA denies that to this day. In 1971, Winston Scott was preparing his memoirs. 2 days before meeting with CIA Chief Helms to discuss this, he dies of a heart attack. No autopsy was done. The CIA seized his papers and all notes. In the 1980s, a manuscript was returned to his son with everything after 1948 gone. Eladio del Val was an anti-Castro Cuban exile who worked with pilot David Ferrie, mentioned above, to firebomb the sugar fields in Cuba. DA Jim Garrison wanted to interview him too, but in 1967 he was tortured and shot point blank only hours after the death of David Ferrie. Roger D. Craig was a Dallas PD officer. On November 22, 1963, he ran towards the grassy knoll where he interviewed witnesses. 15 minutes after the shooting, he observed a man he would identify as Oswald leave the school book depository and enter a station wagon driven by another man. Craig was with other officers when a rifle was found on the 6th floor of the school book depository. He insisted that the rifle found was a 7.65 Mauser and not a Mannlicher Carcano. He testified to the Warren Commission about both of the above and was ignored. In 1967, he was a prosecution witness for Jim Garrison in the Clay Shaw trial. Later that year, he would be shot, but survived. In 1973, a car would force him off the road, but he'd survive. In 1974, he was shot and survived. 1975, he survives a car bomb. Later, 1975, found dead of a gunshot wound. With the Church Committee, 1975, and the House Select Committee on Assassinations, 1976, investigating the CIA, the next round of deaths start. Sam Giancana was the boss of the Chicago outfit and worked with the CIA on assassination plots against Castro. In 1975, he was called to testify to the Church Committee about CIA mob connections. Police officers were detailed outside of his house, but someone managed to get by and shoot him. John Roselli was another mobster involved in CIA plots against Castro. He testified once to the HSCA, but when they tried to call him back to get more information, they couldn't locate him. In 1976, he was found cut up and stuffed in an oil drum. David Sanchez Morales was a notorious CIA hitman and chief of operations for the anti-Castro JM Wave station in Miami. An investigator for the HSCA attempted to locate him and was given the runaround by the CIA. The circumstances of his 1978 death are very suspicious. Thread below. So by 1973, CIA agent David Sanchez Morales is drunkenly bragging to his friends and his attorney about how he was involved in the JFK and RFK assassinations. Quote, "Well, we took care of that SOB, didn't we?" In 1977, Gaten Fonzie, the investigator for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, interviews CIA agent David Atlee Phillips about David Morales. He is told that David Morales is an unimportant agent who likely died as a result of drinking, but David Morales was still alive. He was also not an unimportant agent. He had been chief of operations at JM Wave, the South Florida CIA station where assassination and other plots against the Castro government were directed. A co-worker remembers him screaming and throwing furniture over 1963 interference by RFK. Fonzie also discovered that Morales had worked closely with mobster John Roselli and those plots against Castro. Roselli was interviewed by the HSCA in 1976 and shortly after was found cut up and stuffed in an oil drum. That's the guy we had talked about before. In May 1978, while the HSCA is wrapping up, David Morales travels to Washington, D.C. to have drinks with some old agency buddies. A few days later, he tells another friend, "I don't know what's been going on with me. Ever since I left Washington, I haven't been feeling very comfortable." Later that night, Morales has a massive heart attack. The ambulance took hours to arrive and didn't bring any oxygen. His friend estimates it took the ambulance 5 hours to bring him to the hospital. Thus ends the HSCA attempt to interview David Morales. Okay, so I know this is kind of confusing, but mid-thread he links to another thread he had done earlier in the month where he wrote as if he was the victim here. He writes, "I'm William Sullivan, FBI Head of Domestic Intelligence 1961 to 1971. In 1977, days before I was to testify before the HSCA, I was walking through the woods near my retirement home and was mistaken for a deer and shot through the neck and killed. In 1972, I told journalist Robert Novak that someday he would read about my death in some kind of accident, but not to believe it would be murder. The HSCA I was supposed to testify before was, of course, investigating the assassinations of JFK and MLK. Hale Boggs was the House Majority Leader and a member of the Warren Commission. Though he had supported the report publicly, privately he dissented and believed Hoover lied his eyes out. In April 1971, he begins publicly attacking Hoover and the FBI. October 1972, he dies in a plane crash. I do want to interject here and say that I actually know a lot about this specific case. I know it just represents one case, and this whole thread that he lays out. But I listened to a great podcast called Missing in Alaska, and it was completely dedicated to the Hale Boggs case. And besides Hale Boggs, there was actually another congressman on that plane. And the podcast goes into it in incredible detail, and it's actually like really good journalism that this guy does. He goes to Alaska, he goes to Arizona, because there's all these crazy mob ties, and after things were getting like really hot in Chicago, they decided to move to Arizona, the mob did, to sort of get the heat off of their back. And so there's crazy connections between the mob and this plane going down, and I highly recommend listening to that podcast if you want to know more information about this one specific death, or suspicious death. But let's keep going. Wow, I'm not even going to attempt to try to pronounce this guy's name. We'll just call him George. George was a petroleum geologist, a white Russian immigrant, and a CIA agent who formed a friendship with Lee Harvey Oswald in Texas. In exchange, he was given assistance securing an oil contract in Haiti in 1963. By the time of the 1970s investigations, George was a scared man. In 1976, he wrote a chilling letter to his friend, CIA Director George H.W. Bush, asking him to, quote, remove the net around us, as he and his wife were having their phones bugged, and we are being followed everywhere. Bush wrote back that he did not know what George was talking about. In March 1977, HSCA investigator Gaten Fonzie left his card at George's house for an interview. Later that same day, George was found dead of a shotgun blast. In 1978, his wife denied it was suicide. This is an incomplete list, but I tried to include only the most blatant deaths that could be directly connected to the assassination. If you know others I missed, let me know. Any one of these deaths could be dismissed as coincidence. For 17 plus such deaths, that becomes more absurd. People want to pretend that this requires some impossibly vast conspiracy. Information compartmentalization is the basis of the CIA. It's not necessary to tell a mob hitman why something has to be done. A soldier follows orders and knows better than to ask questions. So that was the end of this guy's thread. I thought it was really interesting. I kept reading, and then there was another death, and another death, and another death, and then people are getting chopped up and put into barrels, and it just blew my mind, so I thought I'd share it here. If you like this type of video and type of content that I'm making, consider liking this video and subscribing, and we'll see y'all in the next video. Peace.